I'm grateful on behalf of the Congregational Resourcing Team that you decided to come here. By the end of the day, our hope is that many of you will have some new tools in your tool bag to help you do kingdom work, and you'll feel that the day was a good use of your time. My presentation will be done, this 1 hour presentation will be done in 3 20-minute parts, as Lynn mentioned. I'll be leading off giving you a 100-mile-per-hour overview of the faith formation process. I'm going to start with how faith formation was done during the time of Jesus' ministry and in the early Christian centuries. We'll then continue on to how it was done in the Middle Ages and right to how it's generally done today. In the end, though, my hope is to tease you with the idea that maybe we need to return to doing some of our faith formation work intergenerationally, the way it was so successfully done in years gone by. After me, there'll be 2 other 20-minute presentations. The Reverend Becky Downs is going to be talking about Summer Mission Camp, and Kate Cross is going to be talking about Messy Church at Spring Branch, both that have intergenerational components to them. So let's go ahead and begin. The definition of faith formation that resonates with me is it is a lifelong journey that's composed of 3 parts. The first part is it starts as becoming a believer, and we have examples of that in the New Testament where Jesus or the disciples would preach and 3,000 people are converted. They became, in fact, one of the translations says they became believers. The second part, though, is that those believers decide that they want to know more. They want to learn more about this faith, and so they become disciples, and disciple comes from that root word which means discipline, or a person who disciplines themselves to learn something, whether it's running or whether it's painting. The third part of the faith formation process is becoming an apostle. A lot of us tend to get stuck in that second phase of being a disciple, and we sit in the pews, we come to church, we come to Bible study, we come to Sunday school, and we learn more and more and more and more, but we never do anything with it, or we do very little with it. And so the concept of the Matthew 28:19 of going into the world, making disciples, and teaching the faith, that's, for me, the culmination of this lifelong faith formation process. In the early Christian church, the early Christian centuries, Christianity, or Jewish Christianity as it was in its earliest iteration, there was a lot of persecution going on. So it really wasn't too smart to be too obvious about being a Christian and sharing your faith and learning more of that disciple part. So what happened is a lot of the faith formation took place in homes. And as you can see on the slide, this is an example of people sitting around a table or on the floor eating food, talking, sharing stories about, did you hear what Peter said today in the synagogue? And, did you hear what Jesus said? And on. And that faith formation process is being done intergenerationally, not by necessarily choice, but by default, because back in those days, people didn't have 4,000 square foot homes with playrooms in the office room and 5 bedrooms where you could shuttle the kids off to while the adults did all the heavy thinking in the living room. In those days, everybody was in the same room. And so children were learning the faith by hearing what the elders were saying, and elders were learning more about their faith when the children would ask questions. Tell me more about that. What do you mean when you say whatever? So this concept of learning intergenerationally was a big part of the early Christian church. We then move on at 100 miles an hour to the Middle Ages, where most people were relatively illiterate. That doesn't mean they were stupid, it just means that they didn't read or write. So written material was not useful or particularly useful to the average person. And even in those days, the clergy wasn't necessarily highly educated either. They may have known enough basic theology to get by, to preach some sermons. They may be able to say the Mass in Latin and probably knew what they were saying, but if you asked them to carry on a conversation in Latin, we were probably at a roadblock. And even as more written material became available, especially with the Bible being translated into the common language, into the vernacular, there was still much illiteracy. So even though there may have been a community Bible, because remember in those days, Bibles were hand done, and so they were very expensive. You didn't just go down to Barnes & Noble and buy a paperback version of the Septuagint. If there was a copy of the Bible in a village or a town, it was usually one or two or three, and sometimes it was actually in the church. So if you wanted to go look at it, you had to go look at it in the church. In those days, a lot of faith formation took place during the process of confession and penance, where you would go to confession and you and the priest would discuss the ramifications of the sins you had committed, and hopefully appropriate penance would be given you as a way to help you heal from this breach with God. Additionally, there were catechisms that were done. Sermons were a good way for people to learn the faith and begin forming their faith. And the church calendar had its seasons, Easter and Advent, and the stories that were told around those big church season events helped people learn their faith as well. We then get down to the 18th and 19th century. Much of the Middle Ages teaching formats did continue, but there was an emphasis as people became more and more literate. There was the desire to teach people the Bible, especially children, because there was a belief that the Satan and the devil were out there and actively trying to get a hold of you and take you down, and one of the best ways that you could protect yourself from that was knowing what was in the scriptures. And so the scriptures weren't just for adults, they were also teaching at an age-appropriate level to children so that they could also, quote-unquote, thwart the devil if necessary. Then 1700s, there was the rise of the church school movement. Some congregations still call their Sunday school program church school, but this was a different thing. This is where, in this era, children were working in industry, which is why we had child protection laws now, but they were working 6 days a week in mills and factories and whatnot. And so they weren't having an opportunity to be educated. So a group of people began putting on Sunday schools. It was actually the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, to teach children so that they could be better educated. Now, the key thing is many of them used the scriptures as the basis for the reading and the writing, and you could also probably stretch that to the arithmetic. 3 disciples plus 3 disciples is how many? All right, I'm sorry, I divert. So into the 20th century now, in the early 20th century, we had this dramatic rise in psychological knowledge. Studies and things were done that gave us insight into the way people think and the way they process information. And alongside of that, or coincidental to that, was the concept of developmental theory, how children develop and how teenagers develop. Actually, I don't know that teenagers actually do develop. Never mind. teenagers develop and how adults learn. And we began getting into this concept of separating by age and stage. So you had, the little children age-wise in this room, and you had the young children in this room, and then you had the middle schoolers in this room, and you had the teenagers in this room, and the adults in this room. So that's separating by age. And also you could separate by stage of life. And this is actually began, I guess, in the school system, as a way of teaching, and the churches kind of adopted it, said, that makes great sense, let's, we got 5 rooms, so we have 5 Sunday school classes and whatever. The problem is we began moving away from this intergenerational faith formation concept because the little kids are in that room and the adults are in that room, and they only meet in the car coming and going. The problem is separation by age and stage made it difficult to learn and practice faith formation like it was done in the early days in the early Christian church. So while formation actively takes place in many Christian homes today, in other families, the faith formation process has essentially been outsourced to the church. We're not necessarily teaching children in the home with the level of depth that we used to do back in the day, and we've sort of outsourced faith formation to Sunday schools and to directors of Christian education. Nothing wrong with that, but just remember, we've outsourced that to the congregation or to the church. And here's the problem with that. If a child or a young adult or a tween or a teen or even an adult gets their faith formation primarily from the Sunday school program, that's 1 hour, 2 hours a week. So this idea of constantly reinforcing faith formation, it isn't quite happening. The problem, though, is if we're not careful, faith formation can devolve into simply a download process, a knowledge transfer process. And in my work as the faith formation coordinator for Sugarland, I'm bombarded by curriculum publishers. They've got booklets and catalogs, buy our DVD set and whatnot. And I'm thinking, gosh, that's just like plug my headphones in, put in the DVD, and download your data from your brain to mine. But there's no faith formation going on. There's knowledge transfer, but I'm not sitting in a room with Gary, for example, a good friend of mine, and we're sharing struggles, and we're sharing questions of faith, and we're sharing insights that we've gained. So not only have we kind of, in a well-meaning way, outsourced that faith formation to the Sunday schools in many cases have become a knowledge transfer function rather than a faith formation process. So the thing I want to tease you with is that intergenerational faith formation, all generations in the same room, makes sense, and we ought to think about ways that we can get back to that. But it's not the only answer, but it is an answer, and I think we need to recapture that. I want to give you a couple of quotes. I'm going to reference this book in a couple of slides down the road, but this is from Holly Catterton Allen, who along with, can't remember her name now. Anyway, she said, intentionally combining the generations together in mutual service, sharing, or learning within the core activities of the church to live out being the body of Christ to each other. In the intergenerational environment, there's comprehensive mutuality, equality, think about that one for a minute, and reciprocity that makes individual and collective transformation more likely. So in that room where you have all generations, they're all equal. Now, they don't have equal functions, because obviously as an adult, I have adult responsibilities, and my granddaughter, when she gets old enough to begin a faith formation process, she'll be working at a different level, but she and I are equal. We're on the same path going towards what Ted was talking about, heading towards the living into the Christ-like life. Holly also goes on, she says, intergenerational ministry is not just about and to benefit children and youth, it's about and to benefit people of all generations. Dr. Tori Schmidt, those of you that were at the APSI conference in Galveston in February, she was one of the keynote speakers. She's the regional minister for faith formation for the Canadians way up there. She says, it's through our rubbing shoulders with one another, telling stories of faith to each other, and by experiencing God's incredible love in Christian community that our youngest members grow into faith, our oldest members pass on their faith, and our families learn to practice their faith together. So, the question is, whether it's Spring Branch or Heritage or Pines, percentage of intergenerational faith formation is right for your congregation. If you're not doing it at all, maybe you want to start with 10%. If you're like Spring Branch, where you already have a messy church program that's going, and intergenerational faith formation is maybe 20, 30% of your congregation faith formation activities, maybe you need to amp it up a little bit. I think the average that they're trying to suggest is somewhere between 40 and 60%. So that's things like, our family night suppers, having intergenerational Sunday school classes, messy church programs, and those kinds of things. Vacation Bible school. Think about if you took your vacation Bible school, instead of having it in the fellowship hall down here, we probably at Pines are going to do. How about if you took your vacation Bible school over to a nursing home or a retirement center and engage some of those folks who can't get out and give them an opportunity not only to teach, but to learn from those children. Confirmance class, where you have adults not just downloading the confirmation curriculum, but they're in communion with people like Ron and Helen, who can share their faith journey from their perspective, and the young people can ask questions and share faith perspective from their perspective. So here's some questions as I wrap up, and I'm not going to answer these, but I want you to think about these as you go home. If faith formation relies heavily on the Christian education program, is it a problem that CE generally has children only for that 1 hour or so a week? What are we doing for those children the other 24/7? Should be 24/7. Oh, I have to get 2 disciples plus 2 disciples, whatever. If kids don't connect with the worship service because it's geared to adults, maybe we should modify worship. If children and youth are separated out of the worship service, do they miss an important faith formation experience that comes from being in company with the entire faith community? And should we intentionally provide regular time and space for people of all ages to tell their faith story to each other? That is, times when they felt close to God, when they felt more in tune with their spiritual journey, a defining faith formation moment, whatever. How would we provide such time and space? Interesting resources that have been helpful to me, and I have to admit, I am still on a journey. I am just out of the starting gate on this intergenerational thing. Holly Catterton Allen and Christine Lawton Ross there's 2 books that one of them is Intergenerate, and the other one, I can't remember the title, Intergenerational Christian Formation. Both of those books would be welcome additions to your church library or your home library. Also, the Presbyterian Church Educators Conference that was in February, their videos are online. They videoed their keynote presentations, and if you're interested in viewing them, if you simply go to that website that's listed, or go to the APSI website, scroll down to videos or whatever the click link is, it'll take you there. And then there's another group called Gen On Ministries. They have a very interesting website as well. So I'm going to wrap up here. I'm going to turn it over to Becky. And hopefully, as you walk out of here today, you will have been teased with the need to begin doing intergenerational faith formation. Thank you all.